So we started the conversation around Larry Fink's letter to CEOs, and a second quote was that there is no company whose business model won't be profoundly affected by the transition to a net zero economy. We recently did a study of 250 of the companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and we objectively rated them using our 7-driver model on reputation and then our 3-driver model on ESG. And we were looking at how the public perceived these companies. There were some fascinating findings. Do you mind sharing a couple? Maybe I'll start with you, Brad.
Sure. And so what we did is we worked with the New York Stock Exchange to identify 250 of the, I'd call them the most significant listed companies on the exchange out of about 2,200. And the first thing that we found, which likely isn't surprising, but should be a concern, is that of the 250, about 100 of them were in the strong range in terms of reputation, but less than 50 were in the strong range around ESG scores. And so on average, there was a gap of 2 or 3 points less for companies around their perceived ESG scores versus their overall reputation scores. So that tells you there's some work to be done there in terms of raising perceptions around ESG specifically. And what's interesting is if you look at both ends of the spectrum, the companies that did relatively not well and the companies that did well in terms of ESG scores, it really wasn't specific to an industry necessarily. So there were some industries, as you would expect, that do a little bit worse. So energy and tobacco and financial services in general. And some companies that you may or may not expect to be in there, like a McDonald's or a Boeing or L Brands at sort of at the lower end of the spectrum. But the ones that I thought were most interesting were the ones that did well in terms of ESG. So these were companies who both had strong reputations as well as strong scores in our strong range for ESG perception. And they were across almost all industry types. So you'd see CPG and grocery and media and tech, to Ann's point, manufacturing, finance, companies like banks, like TD Bank, insurance companies like Aflac, retailers like Tapestry, grocers like Kroger, IBM was in it, Unilever is, of course, we've talked about it, Federal Express. So what you found is that it wasn't really about an industry. It wasn't even about a group of companies in an industry. It was actually about the companies themselves and whether they'd been effective in creating their own narrative and delivering on that expectation around ESG. The one other thing that I'll note, also a note for concern and probably important that Larry Fink talked about it, is if you break out E, S, and G, the individual scores that roll up to the overall score, companies across the board scored better or best in the S, in the social part of it, and scored worst in the E, which is the environmental part of it. So I guess good that he's prescient in knowing that you need to focus a little bit more on the E part, because in terms of how companies are perceived as delivering on the E part of ESG, they're doing the worst of all the three, which also lags overall reputation by a significant amount.
Right. And isn't it interesting? I mean, the year that we've lived through, that there's been this utter reliance on the corporate sector in ways that would have been heretofore unimaginable. So that S being first, kind of front of mind and getting the highest level of praise, perhaps in the scores as we're collecting them, is just really interesting. CVS is highly rated, and they really were a significant force this year in people's lives. The living without CVS would have been almost impossible for people, where every other store was closed and CVS was an option. So there's a COVID dynamic that will be interesting to watch over time to see, how that balances and how these priorities shift. But that authenticity, I think, is what we're seeing, Brad, when you're saying it's a company by company play and not an industry. You have to do the work. You have to think about how you show up in this, and what is your authentic position. I mean, as we've said, 3M is also very highly rated, a mining company. That wouldn't necessarily be intuitively where you would see a brand like that land, but they make a big difference in people's lives and have told a story and are living a truth and acting in a particular way that is representative of ESG goals that other corporations need to uphold.
It's good to hear that industry doesn't need to constrain you anymore. It's been one of the most interesting things as I've reviewed our data over the last year and watched the rise of reputations and then the drop off at the end of the year.